Do you know that more than half of all American workers say that they're dissatisfied with their jobs? You won't find any of those folks on this podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Between Tides, where each episode features fascinating careers and the people who make our lives better through their work. As our occupations continue to evolve in an ever changing world, we no longer ask, "What do you do for a living?" We think the better question is, what are you living to do? Okay, Ben, so your official title at Portage Learning is Film Director 1. What exactly is that, and what is your role here at Portage Learning?
Film director one. The one doesn't really mean much insofar as I know. I think it's more like an organizational thing. But film director is just okay. You have all these projects, a class or an advertisement, or various and sundry things, and you're kind of in charge of the vision of it, right? Pretty much anyone I think can come up to you and be like, "Hey, I have this great idea," but the director's job. This is just true of all film in general, but the director's job is then to be like, hey, here's the overall look, feel, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's the way that we're going to accomplish it, you know. So it's like, for example, you have physics, right? And you could film a physics class in any number of ways, right? You could have someone just stand in front of a whiteboard and do whatever. You could have someone do a bunch of experiments. You could do Mythbusters or whatever. And so insofar as it's like involved with Portage Learning, part of that has to do with okay, what does Portage Learning want to do, right? And how do you best accomplish that, right? If Portage Learning's goal is to help students, then the filmmaking aspect of that should reflect that. It should be clear. It should make sense. It shouldn't be so flashy that you're distracted all the time, but it also shouldn't be so lazy that you get the sense that no one behind the camera cares, right? It's kind of like that balance, so to speak. So that's what I do for the most part at this point.
So I have to be honest, when I think of filmmaking, my mind doesn't gravitate toward higher education initially.
Yeah, mine neither.
So, what made you choose higher education?
I don't know. It's necessarily like I sat there and chose to be like involved in higher education per se. It's what was available to me in my field, and it has allowed me to use tools, passions, however, whatever you want to call it, and be able to learn something new, like learn how to approach things in a different way, right? I when I was in film school, one of my professors, who I liked to be very clear, but I always found this sentiment a little goofy. He said something about how, well, sometimes you just do what you got to do to survive, right? So I spent time making industrial videos, and there's only so many ways that you can show I don't remember what he was doing. And I was sitting there like, well, but like, it's not entirely true, I don't think. I think there's a lot of ways that you can show what you need to show. You just have to be willing to think outside of yourself for a minute, if that makes sense, right? And be like, okay, I'm trying to accomplish a very specific thing in a way that's at least somewhat engaging. And so it's not like I sat there and was like, oh man, my dream job is to be in work for an educational company. Not not because I don't enjoy it, just because when you're like 18, I don't know that that's anyone's dream per se, but I have learned a lot from it that I did not learn in film school just by the nature of what it is, right? There's different problems, there's different ways that you have to approach things, there's different ways that you have to look at things, and unlike saying like film school where they kind of are like, all right, write your story and do whatever. Right now, most of what I'm doing is for someone else, right? And it really isn't, in one sense, it doesn't really matter what I want to do because I have a goal that I need to accomplish for someone else, both in terms of like the company wants one thing, but also the audience is a very specific audience with a very, very specific goal. And in a way, that's actually kind of a nice thing because it's such a specific goal that there's no ambiguity about whether or not you're going to meet the goal, which is nice because sometimes there's a lot of ambiguity and you're like, all right, I don't know what I'm doing here, but
So you've been immersed in our system for a couple of years now. What has been the most surprising thing that you've experienced here?
I don't know if I'm going to say surprising, but I'm going to say like, okay, here's the thing that kind of got hammered home is that just by the nature of how film works now, you do not need a crew of hundreds to make something that looks like it was made by a crew of hundreds, right? The other day, I was filming an ad. It was just me and another coworker, right? And another coworker was there helping out setup, but like eventually it was just two of us filming an ad. And I'm not necessarily going to say that the ad is like going to be airing in a Super Bowl or anything like that, but it looks like more than two people made it. And part of that is just that we've worked together for a while now, right? But I think part of that is also just like, hey, the tech is changing really fast. Processes are getting streamlined, all sorts of kind of corporate speak, shall we say. And I think, again, that's not surprising, right? I don't know that I've ever worked on anything with a crew of more than like 8 people, but it is interesting to see how much you can accomplish with comparatively not a lot of resources, at least like what you might have needed 20, 30 years ago, certainly longer ago than that.
So in general, then, is this maybe the best time in history to be a filmmaker?
That really depends on what you mean by like filmmaking, right? Or filmmaker. If you're sitting there like, is this a great time to be like a Paul Thomas Anderson? No, not even a little bit, because Paul Thomas Anderson wants to do things like shoot on film with big Hollywood stars and that kind of thing. That's expensive, and no one wants to do that at the moment, right? But if you are interested in the form, if you're interested in expanding a lot of things, if you're interested not necessarily in like breaking away from like tradition or whatever, but like exploring new ways of doing things, then it is by far the best time because there's so many new tools and they're so comparatively inexpensive, right? Um, like if you insist on shooting on film, it's a terrible time, but if you're okay with shooting on digital, it's great. This point in history, and part of the reason why I think it's a great time to be a filmmaker is because it's becoming more, or I'm not more, less centralized, right? I don't have to be in LA or New York to make a movie now, right? There's still like elements of it that's still there, right? Just because those were kind of the big places for so long, then you're like, okay, they have a certain infrastructure, but those infrastructures are changing very fast, and it's less about it's less a question of resources now and more a question of like, I don't know, willpower, I guess, but or passion or whatever you want to call it.
All right, let me get personal again. You've had type 1 diabetes since 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that. How has it impacted your life, your career, your work?
I mean, well, I mean, it's not funny, but it is kind of funny. But like, the thing, the thing about like health issues, shall we say? Because diabetes is not the only health issue that I have. I'm like a little autoimmune disaster, but I think the thing that's very interesting about it is the fact that there's a lot more that I have to think about at any given time than um you hear a lot about like indie filmmakers, for instance, who are like struggling to make money, right? It's one thing to struggle to have to make money to get food and shelter and that kind of thing. It's not an easy thing. But in my case, now you have to add on to that things like insulin, which is not cheap, right? Or all the supplies also not cheap, right? So that definitely impacts stuff like a job, right? That's why I'm very thankful for this job, right? Because in one sense, I don't have like I'm not scrounging around to try and figure out how am I gonna like live, you know? Which in turn right, lets me in the time that I'm not at work. I'm not worried about that kind of thing, and now I can kind of focus on my own projects, my own stuff, that kind of thing. Um, as opposed to where I would be otherwise, which most likely would be either not in film or, uh, you know, dying, I guess. Um, that's like the biggest impact, I think, in like a career sense. There's obviously like so many like physical impacts and whatever and what have you, and just things you got to be careful about that, frankly, I'm not usually, but it's not important. If my doctor doesn't listen to this, then it's chill. It's fine. but
So, for members of our audience who might be listening only, you got quite a flow going on back there in your head. And if I had to estimate, your hair probably reaches down about halfway down your back.
yeah,
Tell me
that's
about that. What
not
prompted
unreasonable.
you to grow it out so long?
Um, my my dad. Uh, you know how a lot of middle aged men have this phase where they're like, I don't want hair, right? Like, and they just kind of go with the bald look, right? My dad has done that for a very, very long time. And when me and my brothers were young, we would all get buzz cuts, right? Which, in my memory, I remember hating a lot. Did not enjoy it. Um, and at a certain point, Dad was like, "Okay, if you're whenever you're 10 years old or whatever, you can grow it out a little bit." And it still had to get cut, but it was certainly longer than it used to be. And then I don't know, right around the time I started listening to like rock and roll, I was like, maybe we could go a little longer. And then I kept listening to rock and roll, and my hair kept getting longer. And then I started listening to heavy metal, and the hair got longer. And now I listen to death metal, and the hair is very long. So,
All right, so let's stay with your childhood for a moment. Then tell me, when did you become fascinated with film?
um, I was always pretty fascinated by it. I don't really remember not being fascinated by it. Now the aspects of it that I was interested in have changed. When I was a kid, I was a big fan. Was I still am, but I was a big fan of like fantasy make believe stuff, and I'm old enough that I can remember enough of like a pre CGI time, right? Um, and certainly I watched a lot of kind of fantastic stuff. The two that I remember watching very vividly were Ray Harryhausen movies. It's like Jason and the Argonauts, Golden Voyage of Sinbad, stuff like that, which is the whole like stop motion animation effects, right? Um, frankly, I don't know that I've seen all of those movies all the way through because we usually skipped to the good parts where there were actually effects because that's what's fun. So when I was little, it was special effects that I thought were really neat. I was like, that's super cool. I think mostly just because the thing you lose with the CGI stuff, especially if you're a kid, is you're like, oh, well, that was made in a computer, right? And whereas when you see something and you're like, well, they actually had to do that somehow, that is very interesting because you're like, oh, this could actually exist. And it's like proof that the fantastic things can exist in real life, right? Even if they are puppets or illusions or whatever, they still had to be accomplished physically. And so I would read books on special effects, look at all the diagrams, that kind of thing. But the problem with special effects for me is that I'm not like a particularly crafty person, and I'm not patient enough for special effects. You have to be very patient. There's a lot of trial and error, and I'm not. I'm not like the most mechanically inclined person, and all the effects I would want to do are like very much about being mechanically inclined. So at a certain point in my life, I was going around being like, well, what could I do? I like movies. It's kind of becoming my big interest, whatever. At some point, I mentioned that I wanted to be a director. I didn't really know what a director did. I just knew like that was important,
Sounds
right?
cool.
Yeah, yeah. So all the names people threw out there were either actors, which I did not want to do, because yeah, why would I do that? But or directors. And for Christmas in probably '09, I would have been, I don't know, 12 maybe, 11, 12, somewhere in there. My uncle gave me a book that I still have. It's called Movie Makers by Ian Freer. And it's like 50 influential world famous directors, something like that. And it's 2 to 4 page like mini biographies of 50 directors, right? Some of them I'd heard of, Alfred Hitchcock, D.W. Griffith, William Wyler, stuff like that. Some of them I'd never heard of. Bernardo Bertolucci, Ingmar Bergman at the time, Akira Kurosawa, stuff like that. And I remember flipping through towards the back of the book, and you turn the page, and there's like this picture. So each like capsule biography had like a full page picture of the director, and then you flip the page, and there was the biography. And it was the picture of this guy with absolutely wild hair, which is goes with the theme. And he has this like very strange, like very like mischievous look on his face in the picture. And the name was Tim Burton. And his biography was one of the shortest in the book. Actually, it was only like 2 pages. Um, but I remember reading through it. I was young enough that I read through it and it would describe these things, and I was like, who the heck thinks of these ideas, right? Like bioexorcists and weirdo Batman and guys with scissors for hands and Nightmare Before Christmas and and I'd seen these images before because like I've lived in a post Nightmare Before Christmas world, so everyone's seen those images. Um, but what struck me about it, because then I had to go find these movies and watch them as much as I could, and what I thought was so interesting was how distinctive his movies were. And that's what kind of officially kickstarted things for me, because I was like, oh, he's making things, at least as far as I knew, no, um, he's making things kind of for himself, right? Because he has things that he wants to explore that are fairly unique to him, and I was like, I want to do that. That sounds interesting. I have a lot of disparate interests that I would like to explore, and I have a hard time, ironically, given what we're doing right now, I have a hard time exploring those verbally. Um, but filmmaking, like the imagery and the way that it put together, it just made sense to me, and it made sense to me in a in the sense of like no one had to explain to me really how certain things worked, right? Maybe how to articulate how they worked, but like I kind of instinctively knew how it worked. Um, and that was kind of the catalyst for me, because at that point on, I had this very single-minded intention. You can talk to anyone who knew me at that point. That was my single-minded intention for like my entire middle school, high school, college, adulthood, was to become a director. And I am now, which is fun. It's in my job title. It's crazy. Um, which was quite a surreal feeling. I'm not gonna lie. I was like, oh, I made it. Like there we go. So yeah, it's frankly kind of a pathetic obsession, to be honest with you, because I would do things like read like college textbooks on film history cover to cover, right? Like even college students don't read those books cover to cover, but and at the time, frankly, I was reading books that were going way over my head. But what I would do is I would like write down all the names of all the movies that were referenced by anyone, and then go look them up. And I'd read as much as I could about them if I couldn't find them, or I'd just watch them and just pick stuff up from that. Um,
So, how many movies have you seen in your lifetime?
Given that obsession, not really very many. Probably like somewhere in the area of probably like 2,500
Mm.
is my guess.
So, break those down. what percentage were awful, what percentage were good, and what percentage were fantastic?
I am very much of the opinion that most movies are at least interesting. I've seen very few truly awful movies. I've seen a few, and they stink, and they are aggressively terrible. The vast majority of movies I've seen, and what I think is kind of the baseline for a movie to be like passable, is like 3.5 stars, and that's the vast majority of movies that I've seen. And I've seen probably about, I don't know, probably like 400 of those, like, say 2,500 movies are movies that I would give like a 4.5 or a 5. Whereas there are only 10 or 15 movies that I would say are so shockingly bad that I've ever seen that I'm like, that was a waste of celluloid and everyone involved should feel bad. Like, like, which I hate to say because it's like it takes a lot of work to make a movie and I don't want to denigrate anybody, but like,
All right, let's name names. Give me one
name
or two of
names.
those.
Uh, the worst movie I've ever seen is American Pie.
Oh,
I hate that movie because it commits the cardinal sin of comedy, which is it's not
tell us.
funny. It's not funny even. I don't remember laughing once. It stank. It was terrible. Um, the last movie that I watched that I believe that whenever I reviewed it, I said that it was oafishly inept, and I meant it. Was the movie 28 Weeks Later. So there's 28 Days Later, right, which came out, what, 2002, and was very good. 28 Years Later came out earlier this year, and that was really good. I mean, okay, really good. I don't know that either of them are like perfect movies or anything, but like they're very good movies. 28 Weeks Later, terrible. Terrible doesn't even begin to describe it, to be honest. I was like, man, this is wretchedly bad, which is kind of a shame because certainly there's a lot of actors in there who are very good, right? I mean, Idris Elba's in there for a little bit, Jeremy Renner's in there for a little bit, Imogen Poots and Robert Carlyle and all these other people. But the movie itself is a slog. I mean, when you spend the whole time cheering for characters to die because they're so annoying, you've done something horrifyingly wrong. Like it's not good. That's not what I should be hoping for in a movie, right? I'm like, oh my goodness, would you just succumb to the virus so that we can end this movie? I don't care if the world ends. I'm having a terrible time. Like,
So let me bring you back then to the positive.
oh, good. Oh, whew, all right.
How do you define a great film? What makes a film great?
I like what Roger Ebert would say when he was reviewing movies, where he was like, he would usually judge a movie based on how well it accomplished what it was trying to do, right? And I don't know that that covers every movie, but that's not a bad, like, baseline. But I know that for me personally, I like seeing. I think there are like two kinds of movies that I respond to, and they're semi-related, but they're either the director is willing to go just all out in whatever that means, right? Just fully commit to the movie, or the director is unafraid, right? Um, like if I see a movie like a horror movie where the monster is hiding in the shadows and it's all suggested and you're not seeing it, I'm like, oh brother, I don't want to see this. This isn't creative at that point. But if someone shows me the monster like immediately, then I pay attention because I'm like, oh, you're not afraid of what could be, right? Um, if that makes any sense, because I think there's a lot of filmmakers who play things very, very safe just out of fear, right? My budget's too small for this, or audiences want this, which who knows what audiences want? No one knows. There's no way to know what an audience wants. Did audiences want weapons? I don't know that they did, but they responded to it, to use an example from this summer. Uh but those are like the things that I look for, right? And I think the thing that makes that tricky is that that changes from movie to movie depending on what you're looking at.
So let me ask it this way: is there, again, this is just your opinion, is there a perfect movie or a near perfect movie that you have seen?
Jaws, which has been a matter of some disagreement in the office.
That's what I hear. So you make your case then. Why? Why is it a perfect film?
um, can I give you a pathetically nerdy answer?
Bring it.
All right, perfect. Um, I think Jaws is a perfect movie because it's a perfect melding of. If you look at movies from, let's say, 1920s, so middle towards end of the silent era, to I don't know 1960 when the studio system started breaking down, you get a very like classical narrative cinema. I like old Hollywood, so to speak, right? And I think the thing about old Hollywood and the older films like that is that they were made by craftspeople, right? The people directing those, it's not that they weren't artists, and it's not even that they didn't approach movies as art, but they approached it as a craft, right? Um, so they sat down. The studio system was a little bit of an assembly line, right? You got your script, you assigned a director, you assigned stars, you went for it, right? You made the movie. Um, but out of that, you get a very kind of standardized set of rules, so to speak, continuity rules, and kind of different shots mean different things, and different techniques are gonna create different effects, whatever. Roughly, you get the 60s, 70s, right? Jaws came out in 75. So for about 15 years there, you have that's like the first generation of people who would go to like a film school and learn these rules. But, if you're going to a school, your initial impulse is not really to learn the rules, it's usually to break them. And I mean that in several layers if you're going to college, but like but um and so you would get all these people who are starting to treat film as art, so to speak. I don't know why I put that in quotation marks. I think it's art, but like they were looking at themselves as artists more than like craftsmen, right? And again, not to say that the old directors didn't look at themselves as artists, but I think the emphases were a little different. And so all of a sudden, filmmaking was starting to become more kind of overtly personal, right? I think film was always personal. That's the whole like auteur theory thing that came out 50s, 60s. But now instead of like having a studio system that kind of assigned things, you still had studios, you still had that kind of system to some degree, but like it was changing and people were kind of more brazenly bringing in their own kind of personal excesses and things like that in. Point being, Jaws is like the perfect melding of old Hollywood and the new Hollywood at the time. It's very classical in its construction, right? Not simply in like the storytelling, but in the filmmaking itself. But there's a lot of things in there that are very, to my mind, very like much a product of the time, right? There's all these new ways of doing things. You have these new-ish ways of using zooms and telephoto lenses and things like that. Um, and so, from a filmmaking perspective, I look at it as a great melding of styles, right? And I think Spielberg at the time, um, I'm not overly fond of Spielberg's films post, I don't know, Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Some of them are fine, some of them not so much, right? Um, but Jaws, I think, was still young enough and naive enough to not know that he couldn't do it, if that makes sense. Orson Welles at one point I think said about Citizen Kane, someone asked him, how did you come up with all these like revolutionary techniques or whatever, and his answer was ignorance. Right? He was like, I didn't know I couldn't do that. right? And I think Spielberg didn't know that he couldn't do certain things either, right? It wasn't his first movie. I think it was his third or fourth, maybe, but at least feature film. Um, but I think he still had enough of kind of a good arrogance about him to be like, no, we can shoot this all on the ocean or whatever, or we're gonna do this kind of thing. We're gonna set it up this way, or when the shark doesn't work famously, then we're like, all right, we'll just the camera will become the shark at a certain point, things like that. Um, and I think there's a certain amount of I don't like the word arrogance. Maybe I will say ignorance instead, where you're like, I don't know what I can't accomplish, so I'm just gonna go for it. And again, I think that is kind of related to okay, what do I look for in a good movie? Yeah, kind of that.
So that one though, Jaws made a ton of money
Hmm.
at the theaters. Give me an example of another perfect or near perfect movie that didn't quite capture the imagination of the masses. And why do you think it didn't catch on?
I guess in 2021, I want to say, I think it came out in 2021. My favorite movie of 2021 was a movie called Censor, Censor, right? Director's name is Prano Bailey Bond. She's Welsh, I think. This is a horror movie, which I'm very fond of. And I thought it was really great. I watched it. I was like, this is so interesting. This is so fascinating to me. The filmmaking, the way that the filmmaking serves the film, and the themes that it's bringing in, and the way that it's told, and the central performance. I forget her name, but she's amazing in it. No one talks about this movie ever. And I think in modernity, anyway, that's just because there's so much stuff. I think back when you had Jaws, you had a certain kind of monolithic culture. You know what I mean? Right? Whereas now you have the internet. And I'm a huge fan of the internet. I think the internet's a great thing. But you should not be surprised when all of a sudden there are all this competing information is competing for your eyeballs, right? In a way that it wasn't in 1975. And so now you have movies like Censor that I love that just go completely under the radar, right? That no one talks about. Certainly not at the level that I think they should, right? I think too, like some movies that I think are perfect or near perfect, just for whatever reason, fade out of like the public mind. One of my all-time favorite movies is a movie called Pale Flower, which is a Japanese movie from might be from 1960. It's amazing. Top 5 movie of all time in my mind, right? Certainly for me. This great like half yakuza story, half doomed romance, half nihilistic credo. It's amazing. It's awesome. If that doesn't sell it to you, I don't know what will, to be honest. But I never see anyone talk about that movie. Right? I think it stands very much on par with like any movie from the 60s. It might frankly be my favorite movie from the 60s, when push comes to shove. But for whatever reason, it just has faded out, whether that's just because of age, whether that's because people can't get past the fact that it's in Japanese, or whatever reason, I don't know. Um, and I think that it is very interesting to me, right? We live in a time when like you're sitting there and you're going, man, we have all sorts of stuff available to us, right? But we don't really. I mean, film is a very very fragile medium, right? Um, I think 90% of silent film is gone forever, right? Something like that. Like forever. Like there's no possibility of ever seeing it, right? That's insane, right? Like that's like 90 like it's not like a few movies here and there. It's like 90% of it is gone, right? Like irretrievably gone. And I don't know. I think that's why I get so, for lack of a better word, evangelistic about some of the movies that I like, because I'm like, hey, if I die and no one else likes it, the likelihood that like this just disappears forever is fairly high. I don't know if that's the tangent you were hoping to go on, but that's where we're going.
I'm asking for a friend here.
Oh,
Tell me the difference between someone who frequently goes to the movies and someone who loves cinema.
I think someone who frequently goes to the movies enjoys the movies, which, okay, right. That seems fairly obvious. Right. Maybe enjoys the storytelling of it, maybe enjoys seeing famous people's faces blown up to massive proportions, or to like slightly less massive proportions on TV, whatever. But I think that's someone who like goes, enjoys it, gets something out of it, whether that be like a fun story or some kind of like message or whatever, some kind of theme, and then goes home, right? And might still think about the movie, might see it again. I think someone who loves cinema understands that cinema is a language just as much as it is an art form, and is interested in learning about the language.
What do you mean by that? Elaborate.
I think I think film, this is one of the things that like I get excited about and that I've learned to become more excited about as I've gotten older and learned more, is that a filmmaker is a linguist just as much as they are like an artist, because film is, I think, a new language, right? Film for a long time, is certainly when it first began, was a purely visual language, right? You didn't have words to rely on unless you cut in intertitles. And so you had to be able to communicate what you were trying to say without words. I think that's what makes filmmaking such a weird profession right now, is something like literature or something like even painting or drama or storytelling or whatever, whatever we're thinking about, has been around for, no matter your views on how the earth started or whatever, it's been around for at least like 6,000 some odd years, right? Which is a pretty long time, right? Long enough for it to have a pretty good sense of its own identity, right? Film, a generous age for film would be like 145 or something like that, right? Barely out of the infant stage, right? So it's not only like a language, it's a brand new language, right? That we still don't even have fully defined yet, right? Um, and so if you're a filmmaker right now, you're both a linguist and an explorer, because you're still figuring out what this thing is even is, right? Which I think is very exciting. Um, but again, that's where you run into that whole, is it a good time to be a filmmaker? Well, if you're interested in exploring, then yes, because right now is the perfect time to explore, because everyone's in a panic mode because no one knows what it is, right? Um, and so I think that's the major difference between someone who goes to the movies a lot and appreciates them and someone who's like a cinephile or whatever, right? I think a cinephile is someone who understands its language and is interested in that, as opposed to someone who goes and is like, oh yeah, Tom Cruise was in however many movies and has been married to these people and that kind of thing. I'm like, all right, and that's cool. Don't know that. It's kind of creepy that you know that much about Tom Cruise, but like, like yeah, whatever.
Okay, let's rattle these off now. Give me your Mount Rushmore of film directors.
Um, I'll give you so the disclaimer that I'm gonna say is that I'm not necessarily gonna say that these are like the four greatest filmmakers of all time, but I'm gonna say they're the four that like I look up to. Right? You have Tim Burton for obvious reasons, I think, right? He's very much the Kickstarter, if you will. You have in like high school and college, I got very heavily into the like Japanese film directors. So the greatest of those to my mind is Akira Kurosawa, and I think that a lot of people would probably agree with me on that, and just as many would probably disagree. But oh well, their loss. If you want a perfect movie, my favorite movie is Seven Samurai, and I think you could learn everything about filmmaking from that movie. Um, my next director would be the director that I got heavily into late college and throughout adulthood, and that's David Cronenberg. Um, just I came to him initially from like my love of horror, and then I ended up being like, oh man, this guy is doing exactly the kinds of things I want to do. Not necessarily the same content per se, but the same kind of like tone, if you will. Very observational as opposed to like it's the difference between someone saying I have something to say versus someone saying I'm curious about this.
Hmm.
I'm very curious about a lot of things, right? The last one I would say would be the filmmaker I was introduced to in college by one of my professors, and the first filmmaker who I watched, and I was like self conscious of the fact that cinema was a new language, and that's a guy named Andrei Tarkovsky. He's a Russian filmmaker who has a style that could generously be called different. um, you'll get a lot of people who try to imitate his style because he's very. First of all, his movies are long, right? And they're very much his book is called Sculpting in Time because that was his argument was that film is the thing that makes film unique is its ability to sculpt in time, as he said. Um, and he only made 7 movies, and he died very young, like 54 maybe, of cancer. Um, but each movie is very much. I don't know if you've ever heard movies called poetic
Hmm.
before, but he's like the best at that kind of thing, right? I think personally because he was focused on cinema as a language as opposed to cinema as a tool for saying what he wanted to say. Not that he wasn't interested in that, but I think he was curious as to how he could use cinema as cinema or film as film to tell his stories or give his thoughts or whatever. Um, so those are like my 4 that I go back to over and over and over again. And I'm like, oh wow, I like how they do it. Now let's put them all together and make some kind of mutant freak, and then it's me.
Hmm.
So like,
I love that.
there we
Well,
go.
tell me then, what does this mutant freak bring to our courses? I've been told,
What
and
a
I'm actually,
weird sentence in a vacuum.
but it works for me, so we're going to go with it. I've actually been in meetings with some representatives of colleges and universities who say our courses are the most beautiful they've seen. What makes ours different from, let's say, some of our competitors in this space?
I think I've never been inside any of our competitors' meetings. I don't know how any of our competitors work on like in like what does someone like what does a competitor in my position do? I don't know. I think that here there's a lot of emphasis placed on people, right? And giving the student a really good experience. And I think that's a different foundation than, say, let's crank these courses out as fast as possible or let's get this information out efficiently. I took a couple of online classes in college, right? Just because it was easier to do it that way and cheaper and whatever. And they were the most boring things I've ever taken because I took math. And you're already facing an uphill battle with me with math, right? To be very fair. But it was literally, like a blue screen and someone would go, "Hi, I'm this person," you know, And then you'd see numbers on the board, and you'd get all these example problems, and then bye. It was the most boring thing I'd ever seen, and it also just wasn't engaging. Right? It's not like I sat there and was like, "Oh man, I want to sit there and watch the video." I was like, "I have to watch the video," and I think that's what sets our courses apart, because now we're thinking, okay, we need to make this both engaging, right? Something that people want to sit down and see, right? While also making it clear, right? The information anyway, right? Because at the end of the day, if we make the most beautiful looking set and the most beautiful looking course in the world, but the information is incomprehensible, then it's useless, right? And so I think, and I mean, I came here and people had already been setting that up, that kind of thing, that kind of foundation in place, right? And so it was actually fairly easy for me to come in and be like, okay, there's already kind of a set foundation of here's how we're going to do things, and then to kind of expand off of that a little bit, in the most subtle, boring ways possible, to be quite clear from like a outside of the film team perspective, but and not even things that like come to mind specifically, but just like these little detail things that I brought or that other team members have brought, to make it more clear and more engaging. And I think that's what sets it apart, right? And yes, this is going off of my memory of online classes like 8, 9 years ago, which stinks or stank, I guess, in past tense. I'm not taking them anymore, but I kind of, every time I'm working on a course here, that's what I have in the back of my mind. I'm like, okay, I want to avoid that as much as possible, right? Because I hated every second of that class, and it wasn't just the subject matter; it was the filmmaking itself was terrible, right? And so I think by caring about someone else and wanting to make something for them, even more so than like for me per se, right? Not, I still sit down and I go, okay, because I also think about what I told you earlier about my one professor saying there's only so many ways you can show this certain thing. And I'm like, yeah, but like, it doesn't mean you have to give up, right? You can still be like, okay, I'm sure there's always a better, not a better way, but well, maybe a better way to like approach things, or a way that's going to better achieve your goals, right? It's the nice thing about film is that um, there's so many variables that go into it. So there's a lot of possibilities, even with a 2 to 3 camera setup centered around a desk with someone writing on a tablet.
So talk to the young filmmakers in our audience today. What is one or two things that you learned during your career that you wish you would have known when you were 18?
Uh, there's a weird answer to that, because there's things that I learned that it's good that I learned, but I'm glad I didn't know them. And I think it's that what we were talking about with like Spielberg or Orson Welles or that kind of thing. I think it's that arrogance, because when I made my student thesis film at Liberty, right? I didn't know I couldn't do any of those things, and I didn't know that I like wasn't supposed to make a project of that scale or that kind. I just was like, okay, I'll do it. If I had known the difficulties, I would never have done it, and it would have been half as good. But there's no way to learn that until you've made that mistake, quote unquote. And ironically, I'm trying to get some of the arrogance back, you know, because now I know what's not achievable, and I'm like, ah, man, I can't do that. When 18-year-old, 20-year-old me would have been like, why not? Just go do it, right? Like you've got the stuff, you got friends you can boss around. Like just tell them to do it, right? If you don't want to do it, just make someone else do it. It's fine, right? And that's directing, like. But I think that's the biggest lesson. I think the other big lesson that I would recommend to people. I've never had any issue with this just by nature, but it never hit me how important it was until very recently, which is that, like, I think there's a quote from Werner Herzog somewhere where he talks about, like, someone asked him what you should do if you want to be a good filmmaker, and he said, read, 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 read. And I would say read, but I would replace it with learn. Just like learn a lot about things that you may not even things you have only like a passing interest in. Like, I have interests in a lot of things, not necessarily like obsessive interests, but like I'm curious about a lot of things, right? Even math, which I hate with the burning passion of 1,000 fiery suns, has some interest to me, like some of the applications of it, right? And that kind of thing. And like the whole idea of like the theory of relativity and things like that. Do I understand it? Not even a little bit. But is it still interesting? Yeah. But if all you ever do is you sit around and only look at things either out of boredom and don't actually retain any of it, which is crazy to me, or if you just look at the same things over and over and over again, then the stuff you're going to make is going to be pretty dull, right? I'm not saying that I'm like a great filmmaker or anything like that, but I I think because I have been willing to be a student for a very, very long time, just of all sorts of things, and been willing to learn, I think that's only been a net positive. And I've learned a lot of things that I think have allowed me in my creative kind of pursuits to be way more creative than I would otherwise have been. And so those are kinds of the advice or the things that I would say to keep an eye out for, or to think about if it's something that you're thinking of doing.
That's good. So, Ben, I want to be respectful of your time. So, just a couple more and I'll get you out of here. You've been immersed now in the higher education world for a few years now. Can you see yourself doing this for the next 30 years, or do you think you have a cinematic piece in you as well?
I think I have a cinematic piece in me if you're willing to give me like $10 million.
Mm.
But um I've told some people this, like, I am very happy where I'm at. Right? I get to be creative and be creative very consistently in a place it where I'm like where I'm what's the word I'm looking for? Where I'm allowed to and encouraged to be creative, right? And that's like about as good as it gets if you're into film, right? And I could very happily be here for a very, very long time. But in my heart of hearts, I very much have cinematic pieces in me, right? And, for whatever, like when I graduated school, you had COVID. I've had diabetes, there's a ton of obstacles, right? It's not like, when a lot of people in school are like, oh man, I'm going to make a feature film by the time I'm 25 or whatever, this is my other piece of advice. That's a highly unrealistic goal. Don't make that your goal. If that happens, it's going to be an accident. It's going to be a happy accident, but it's going to be by accident. And so, but I think the fact that that passion is still there and that desire is still there and that I'm still writing, and that like even now I'm like actively working to make another short film at least, right, that's kind of proof positive in my mind that there is still cinematic stuff in there. The head is not just a hat rack. So
All right, this is going to sound like a crazy pivot in our conversation, but you already mentioned that you love the horror genre of film.
uh-huh.
that you love death metal
Mhm.
music. Tell me about Sabrina Carpenter.
uh, that's actually semi-related to the horror because I started listening to her because someone said you should watch the music video for Taste, and that's a very like horror influence. I mean, okay, like it's not really to my mind, but like, but the problem was that I watched the video and I heard the song, and it would not leave my head. I never listened to Sabrina Carpenter before, and and um I was like, okay, this won't get out of my head. And then I started listening to the other songs on the album, and I was like, wait a minute, this is like low key a perfect pop album. And now my super mix on my music caps is like a mix of Cannibal Corpse, Death, and Sabrina Carpenter. Like it's a wild, it's a pretty bipolar experience. I tell you what.
You're sweating, Ben.
I'm not sweating. I'm sweating because it's humid in here. I don't know what you're talking about.
Last
Making me
question.
uncomfortable over there, Tim.
Last question. What have we talked about today that you would like to reiterate to make sure our audience gets it? What's one thing you want them to take away from this conversation?
I am just such a huge fan of film, like as an art form. Um, I love it so much, right? And pathetically so to some degree, right? Um, and I'm throwing out names and movies and titles and things like that that someone may not have heard of. And on a personal note, I would just say look up all those things. Like learn more about it, because it's that's I think film for being like such a young art form has had this extraordinarily outsized impact well beyond its existence, right? The length of its existence. And I think there's so much there that's just ignored, right? Whether just because of age or because of perceived lack of accessibility, right? Or whatever. I would just encourage that you know, look up Pale Flower, look up Tarkovsky, look up Kurosawa, look up Cronenberg at your own risk. I'll say that. But and like I guess just there's this stigma with some of these like art forms, I think, that they're useless, right? They don't really have a pragmatic purpose per se. And I suppose from a certain standpoint, if you're like a very analytical, like, you know, where the net positives, negatives of certain things, maybe, I don't know. But I will say this: my life would certainly be a lot less rich if there wasn't film,
Mm.
and I would be a much sadder person because I think there would be a lot of things in me that I wouldn't have the capability to put out there or to be able to articulate. And I think that would be an absolute nightmare world at that point because I and certainly I know a few other people who would feel very stuck at that point. And I think the best way to understand what I mean by that is to just look for films you might not otherwise look for.
Wow. Oh, that sounds like a good place to land this plane. And Ben, I just want to affirm you for your creativity and the passion you bring to the studio each day. And you inspire me to be better at my craft, and really enjoyed our time together today. I just want to thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.